License and registration, please. Step out of the vehicle.
Sir, may I ask why? I haven't done anything wrong.
That's not up for discussion right now. Keep your hands where I can see them.
I'm staying in the car until I understand. I've served my country. Look, I'm not resisting.
I said step out now, slowly.
Okay, slowly. But I'm still asking you to tell me what the...
Rain-slicked streets reflected the neon glow of a late Chicago evening. Inside his pickup, Jamal Cotter, a decorated Army veteran, felt the hum of exhaustion in his bones, the lingering echo of tours long past. A sudden spotlight cut across the windshield, and a sharp voice ordered him to pull over. In that instant, ordinary routine collided with systemic force, a bureaucratic machinery that could erase a life in a few cold, official steps. Before we dive deeper, take a moment to breathe with this story. Witness not just the events, but the humanity behind the headlines. Watch closely, because this isn't just about one stop. It's a reflection of a system in motion. The radio hum in Jamal Carter's truck was low, almost hypnotic, as he turned north on Lakeshore Drive toward the Navy's end plate glow of the city skyline. Rain had begun again, fine and cold, turning pavement into glass and headlights into streaks of molten white. He relaxed his shoulders, blinking through the fall of drops again. The windshield, just another night's drive through Chicago in January. Then came the flash, a beam slicing through the rear rearview mirror. Sharp and sudden like glass breaking in a quiet room. Red and blue lights danced against the wet asphalt, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the tightening in his chest. Jamal eased his truck to the curb, hands at 10 and 2, watchful and measured. He'd been pulled over before, but never by an immigration and customs enforcement ICE unit. Not in a place like this. The officer approached, bootsteps muted against rain and slick concrete. His posture was rigid, respectful of command but unreadable in intent. Jamal lowered his window, rain trickling in a thin line across the seal. License and registration, the ICE agent said, voice clipped and low, the badge on his chest catching light and fragmenting into slivers of golden shadow. No small talk, no ritual courtesy from the streets, just authority pared down to the barest skeleton of words. Jamal blinked once, a slow realization nudging at his senses. Is there a problem, officer? He asked, voice calm but steady, carrying the weight of hard-earned restraint. He'd served 8 years in the Army infantry. He knew how to hold composure under pressure. But this was different. Outside the rules of base perimeter checks and deployment orders, this was the city. And Chicago didn't run on federal patrols in unmarked cars. The agent studied the papers with an intensity that felt like scrutiny rather than review. Fingers brushed over the plastic card, the state seal, the name stamped beside veteran in quiet print. The air between them thickened not with rain, but with the unspoken history of authority and the citizen's right to move unencumbered. In that long, static moment, Chicago's pulsing lights seemed to dim around them, the traffic noise reduced to a distant hum. Sir, the agent said at last, am I clear to run this through verification? His tone bore procedural precision, what ICE training calls standard identification. Confirmation protocol, yet something in the hesitation undercut the formality. Jamal nodded slowly, realizing this was no ordinary traffic stop. The agent stepped back, radio raised, voice registering the plate and reflecting the call sign. Words like verification, status confirmation, and agency unit request floated in the cold air. Jamal watched the agent's breath fog the night, felt the vibration of his own engine quiet as he braced for what came next. Moments later, another vehicle pulled up behind them. 2 more officers emerged, form silhouetted by headlights and authority. Jamal's pulse quickened, not from fear, but the sudden awareness that this stop had crossed a threshold into something larger, something procedural and bureaucratic with teeth. Chicago isn't a border town. Federal agents don't have unfettered authority to detain citizens without clear cause here, yet there they stood, badges gleaming under sodium street lamps, carrying out an enforcement rule meant for immigration zones. The tension wasn't just in the cold physics of authority, it was in what lay beneath policy, power, and the implied threat of erasure that a uniform so often carries in these parts. The camera of memory, the cinematic lens inside Jamal's mind, zoomed in on the small details. The flicker of the badge against the faint glow of the streetlight, the raindrops racing each other down the truck's window, the subtle tightening of gloves as one agent adjusted his grip on the radio mic. Each tiny motion felt amplified, as though the world around him had constricted into this one moment where history, policy, and personal experience converged, and somewhere between the routine request and the silence that followed, Jamal felt a moral weight settle upon his ribs, the unspoken question of whether he was merely another driver on a rainy Chicago night, or an emblem in a drama much larger than himself. With every second that passed, the stop deepened, foreshadowing troubles not just procedural but profoundly human, where the machinery of power could grind a life down with a bureaucratic hum, and where a single night's drive could become a collision between identity and institution. Rain still slid down the windshield like dissolved glass as Jamal watched the ICE agents congregate under the weak glow of the street lamp. The night had shifted from a simple stop to something heavier, something that felt procedural and personal all at once. His breath was steady, controlled, but inside, a storm of questions churned. Why had this stop escalated so quickly? What justified this level of scrutiny? The first agent remained rigid, eyes flicking back to the radio, and then to Jamal's steady gaze. A second agent stepped forward, voice clipped, and without warming his tone, he barked a command, "Step out of the vehicle." Jamal blinked, his military instincts warring with his civilian mind. Standard field protocol for ICE stops encouraged de-escalation when possible, but the shift from verification to command was palpable. "I'm not resisting," Jamal said slowly, hands visible on the wheel. "I just want to understand what is happening." His voice was calm, but underscored with an unspoken tension, the kind born from years of navigating combat zones where authority could mean life or death. The taller agent scoffed under his breath, as though Jamal's restraint was a provocation rather than composure. "We've asked you to step out," he repeated, leaning in closer, gloved fingers tapping the roof of Jamal, as truck-like punctuation. The air between them cracked, not with violence, but with procedural rigidity that felt indistinguishable from hostility. In training, federal officers are taught to gauge compliance and intent, to look for signs of aggression before escalating force. Yet here, the measured calm of Jamal, as voice seemed ignored. The taller agent, as eyes shifted toward his partner, and in that glance there was an unspoken agreement. We were in control now. Jamal's heart thudded, but he did rise. "I'll step out once I understand the reason for this escalation," he said, each word deliberate. "There's been no traffic violation, no lawful cause to detain me further." The taller agent, as jaw tightened. "You were detainable," he insisted, voice carrying the hollow certitude that comes from bureaucratic training manuals rather than human judgment. "Verifications come back pending further checks." The word detainable felt foreign and cold. No officer had ever used it with him during countless traffic stops before. Jamal was well within his rights, by Chicago and federal law, to ask why he was being held. Yet those rights felt like distant shorelines on a choppy sea. Another voice cut in, clipped, precise, commanding. Jamal recognized this one from the radio chatter earlier, the agent who initiated the call for verification. "We need to clear him further," he said. "Policy dictates we confirm status before release." His body language was rigidly procedural, the corporate posture of an enforcement handbook come alive in flesh. Jamal swallowed. The tension in his chest wasn't rising with fear so much as calculation. A veteran's awareness that sometimes compliance can invite escalation and resistance can invite danger. He asked, "What status?" "I'm a U.S. citizen. My papers are valid. Is this a civil matter or criminal suspicion?" The taller agent didn't answer. Instead, he exhaled a sharp breath, glanced at the other officers, and radioed something that crackled with acronyms Jamal couldn't place. In the quiet that followed, the air felt thicker. Not just rain-dampened night mist, but that slow crawl of power reaching its tentacles into a single halted moment. At the edge of the scene, Jamal caught his reflection in the truck's rear window, eyes steady, jaw set. Part of him noted how strange it was to feel both exposed and oddly grounded. Procedural training for law enforcement emphasizes objectivity and authority. Citizen rights training emphasizes dignity and procedural fairness. But here, protocol and personal identity were colliding in the rain-washed night, each one a shadow on the pavement. Then came a crackle from the taller agent's shoulder mic. "Unit C4 requested supervisory clearance and confirmation of detainable status." His tone was terse, the language a hierarchy, of step-by-step confirmation before proceeding. Suddenly, Jamal realized this wasn't a simple stop. This had become a moment where procedure could writhe into power play. Jamal's mind drifted, not away from the situation but deeper into it, to the countless times a uniform had meant safety, and the rare times it had meant danger. His military memory whispered about protocol adherence during missions, about how miscommunication could cost lives, and here he felt that same principle unfolding not on a battlefield, but on a rain-soaked city street. Another agent stepped forward, clipboard in hand, citing city enforcement policies, Chicago's strict guidelines for federal agencies operating within city limits. "We need authorization before further action," he said, voice weary but firm. "Chicago law requires clear cause for extended detainment by federal officers on city streets." A legal nuance lost on the taller agent. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Jamal's restrained composure wasn't just strategy, it was survival instinct shaped by endless internal reflection. He wasn't passive, but aware, deeply aware of the razor edge between compliance and escalation. And then, as if pulled by the gravity of unspoken judgment, the taller agent took a half-a step back, jaw clenching. The situation had crossed a threshold. Routine long gone, tension now thick, with procedural hierarchy, internal bias, and institutional power. In that quiet moment, under the drizzle, beneath the glow of sodium street lamps, Jamal sensed a shift. This stop was no longer about verification. It had become a confrontation between authority and accountability, between rigid training and human consequence. And as the agents awaited further confirmation, Jamal realized that the path ahead wouldn't just test his right to be treated fairly. It would expose the fragile architecture of power in motion, where a single misstep, procedural or personal, could tip the balance into unforeseeable fallout. Rain-dampened asphalt glistened under muted streetlights as Jamal stood with hands raised, slowly, palms outward, the universal gesture of compliance. Yet here it felt provisional, like a plea cast into a storm. Behind him, the ICE agent's breath steamed in the cold night as radios crackled to life once more, a tide of protocol, chain of men command, and coldly rehearsed phrases that carried more weight than any human voice. "Hands where we can see them." The taller agent barked, the command not loud, but sharp, a blade cutting through the thin atmosphere of uncertainty. In his grip was a radio mic, finger poised like a metronome over an unseen beat, his body already cataloging every step Jamal took as potential threat. The scene had thinned. It was now agent and driver, civilian and institution, face to face in a rainlow-soaked crucible. Jamal's eyes, calm but firm, met the agent's with a kind of weary steadiness. "I'm cooperating," he said, not as explanation, but as an anchor to a reality that no longer felt simple. "Tell me what I'm being detained for." The agent hesitated. A microsecond, that the narrative camera inside Jamal's mind expanded into a quiet echo. In that pause, Jamal saw not just the man before him but the institution his uniform represented. Layered hierarchies of federal policy, enforcement manuals, and what one procedural document would later call UCLO, Overreach Force, Continuum Protocol, all taught to prioritize officer safety above nearly everything else. "They've flagged you for further verification," the taller agent said with the clipped precision of training manuals. Yet his voice trembled with internal uncertainty. "Chain of man command says we hold until clearance." "Clearance," Jamal repeated, a word heavier than rain. He knew his rights. He knew that ICE detainment on city streets required defined cause and that prolonged custody without evidence of wrongdoing skirted legality. Yet here he was, an unarmed black veteran, alone in the night, with agents standing over him like judges of some unseen tribunal. Another agent stepped forward, Bodycam catching the low glow of street lamps on his tactical gear. The device buzzed faintly, recording every micro-expression, every pause. The body-worn camera protocol mandated by ICE, intended to shield truth, instead illuminated the widening gulf between what was happening and what should have been happening. "We don't have probable cause," the second agent muttered, barely audible over the rain. Yet Jamal heard it, a whisper against the rumble of institutional rigidity. "We're caught between policy and power." The taller agent shot him a look, sharp as flint. "We enforce the hold until HQ signals release," he said, voice firm but brittle. "You're not free to leave." Jamal's breath was steady, but inside, years of internal reflection converged in a moment of stark clarity. This was not just procedure confusion. This was the human cost of systems designed to protect, yet capable of devouring the very people they were meant to serve. He lifted one hand and touched the wet collar of his jacket. "You're trained to command," he said softly, "but not every citizen who seeks clarity is a threat." "I have obeyed every instruction." The taller agent's face tightened. And in that tightening, a tiny shift in his gaze, was the violence of uncertainty. It's one thing to recite protocols from training, another to apply them against a person who meets every command with calm reason. The narrative slowed, heartbeats stretched into echoes, as though time itself had paused to hear their unspoken questions. Behind them, The radio squawked with hierarchical communication unit. 4 to HQ. Suspect status pending, awaiting supervisory clearance. Procedures spelled out that every detainment must be logged, reviewed, justified. Yet, here, in the middle of a Chicago street gripped by an unexpected storm, the paperwork had become a wall between human dignity and institutional authority. Then a shift, subtle but seismic. A supervisor's voice crackled through a slightly different channel. Hold position. Do not escalate unless there's immediate threat. The command, meant to de-escalate, instead found the tension. It meant that Jamal was still halted, still in procedural limbo. Jamal felt it then, the human cost beyond doctrine, beyond training. He saw in the agent's eyes a flicker of doubt, a learned rigidity, warning against a quiet recognition that nothing here felt just. The streetlights blurred against the rain, memory and observation folding into one grainy, cinematic moment where two men stood, one armed with authority, the other armed only with truth. No sudden movements, no raised voices. Just the charged silence between them. A crucible testing whether procedure could override humanity. The taller agent exhaled, and his voice, when it came, was steadier but edged with conflict. Step back, he said, not a release, not a surrender, but a gesture toward the frailty of certainty. We can't escalate without HQ order. Jamal lowered his hands slowly. Not of concession but acknowledgement of something deeper. Confrontation was the clashing of weapons or fury, but this, the clash between rigid authority and quiet, unassailable dignity. Every second etched itself into the record, Bodycam blinking red like the heartbeat of this fragile moment. And in that fog of rain and tension, justice stood at the cusp, not yet realized, not yet denied, but hanging between them, waiting for the next choice. The choice that would determine whether procedure protected or preyed upon life. The rain had stopped by the time Jamal's truck rumbled back onto quieter streets, but the night felt heavier, saturated with echoes of authority and tension that lingered long after the agent's lights vanished in the distance. He drove slowly, hands gripping the wheel with a tension that wasn't from physical strain but the weight of a mind replaying every exchange, every word, pause, micro-expression. They all twisted through memory like a looping camera shot. Relentless and exacting. At home, the door opened to a quiet house, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. His daughter Ava glanced up from her homework, eyes wide with unspoken questions. The casual warmth of family routine, the smell of coffee, the hum of a heater, clashed violently with the storm Jamal carried in his chest. He knelt, brushing hair from her forehead, and she whispered, "Daddy, did something happen?" He swallowed, a soldier's instinct still taut, and managed a quiet, measured truth. "Just to stop, sweetie. I'm okay." His voice was calm, but the pause betrayed him, carrying the residue of authority, bias, and near confrontation. The household absorbed it, the small kitchen lights reflecting in silent, curious eyes. It was a moment of human aftermath, ordinary life continuing beside extraordinary disruption. The phone rang shortly after. Legal counsel calling to review what had occurred. Procedural details demanded scrutiny, the ICE agent's adherence to federal verification protocol, chain of command logs, and the legality of detainment on city streets. Each beep and click carried weight, revealing loopholes in the system that allowed escalation from routine stop to morally fraught confrontation. Jamal spoke in measured tones, recounting details with clarity, knowing that every timestamp, badge number, and radio exchange could matter. Community networks stirred as well, local organizations monitoring civil rights and federal enforcement shared Jamal's account, cross-referencing city ordinances with federal policy. The dialogue was sober and procedural, yet threaded with outrage and empathy. Volunteers parsed language from Chicago's municipal codes, scrutinized ICE guidelines, and traced every hierarchical step that had enabled tension to spiral. Jamal listened, his heart heavy, realizing that his personal encounter had become a lens on systemic design, where discretion, bias, and unchecked authority intersected in ways that few citizens could navigate safely. Late at night, the cinematic camera of memory drifted, empty streets glistening under sodium lamps, the faint echo of his truck tires against wet asphalt, and the ghostly hum of radios still vibrating in imagination. Silence hung over the city, in a way that felt almost accusatory, a quiet reflection of human vulnerability in the presence of institutional force. Jamal sat alone at the kitchen table, files and notes spread before him. Legal counsel had advised him to document everything: bodycam timestamps, agents' call-ins, dialogue that had carried implicit threats, and any deviation from standard ICE stop and verification protocols. Procedural rigor became a form of psychological defense, a way to translate subjective experience into a verifiable record that could withstand scrutiny. And yet, in the reflective quiet, he realized the emotional weight went deeper than legality. There was the lingering fracture of trust in law enforcement, in bureaucracy, in a society that promised protection but sometimes delivered peril. Jamal's reflections were neither bitter nor theatrical. They were precise, measured, and human. He understood the machinery of authority but also saw its limits, the vulnerabilities in its design, and the moral questions left unaddressed. How much power should an institution wield before humanity bends beneath it? How many near misses must a citizen endure before the system is questioned? The camera lingered on these private moments, hands folded over notes, a pen hovering uncertainly over paper, the flicker of streetlight through blinds. The cinematic lens was both intimate and forensic, capturing the psychological toll with fidelity. In each pause and every reflection, the story unfolded beyond the immediate event. Jamal was not simply reacting to a traffic stop. He was inhabiting a moral and systemic mirror, seeing the wider implications of authority and accountability. Community forums began to convene, both digital and in person, as neighbors, activists, and concerned citizens dissected the encounter. Procedural gaps were scrutinized, the ambiguous discretion granted to federal agents, the tenuous boundaries between city ordinances and federal enforcement, and the sociocultural assumptions that could convert routine stops into confrontations. Jamal's experience became data, narrative, and symbols simultaneously, proof that the human cost of oversight was rarely visible until reflected in a single person's lived experience. By morning, Jamal walked outside to the quiet of dawn. Chicago's streets were empty, but the city itself seemed alive with lingering questions. He felt a strange clarity. Confrontation and escalation were not isolated events. They were embedded in a system that relied on obedience, procedural deference, and the assumption that authority would be unchallenged. And yet, there was also resilience, his own, and that of communities ready to question and hold accountable. The chapter closed not with resolution, but with awareness. Jamal understood that fallout was both personal and social. It existed in the conversations he would have with his family, in the scrutiny of legal systems, and in the quiet ripples of community reflection. The human and the procedural were inseparable, a cinematic interplay of consequence, morality, and systemic pressure. The city was waking before Jamal's eyes opened, thin light spilling through blinds, a pale blue that softened the harsh edges of the previous night's memories. The stillness was deceptive. Outside, the hum of early traffic held none of the tension of sirens or authoritative commands, yet Jamal felt a lingering gravity in the quiet. What followed that night wasn't just a traffic stop. It had become a reckoning, personal and systemic, psychological and political. In the days that followed, Jamal's encounter was dissected in public forums, city council meetings, and community town halls. Legal experts pored over Chicago municipal ordinances and federal immigration enforcement protocols, comparing them side by side, and revealing tensions in authority, jurisdiction, and accountability. What had once been an ordinary stretch of road was now a point of fracture between citizen rights and institutional power. Every word in the legal documents carrying the weight of precedent and consequence. Across the nation in Minneapolis, a different story was unfolding that amplified Jamal's own reflections. 37-year-old woman, Renee Nicole Good, was killed by an ICE agent during a federal operation, sparking protests, political furor, and deep scrutiny of federal usually enforced policies amid immigration enforcement actions. What had begun as a routine engagement spiraled into tragedy, drawing thousands into the streets demanding accountability and transparency. The systemic critique was stark. Federal enforcement agencies like ICE operate under Department of Homeland Security (DHS) authority, with usually protocols intended to protect officers and the public. Yet in practice, those policies sometimes shield agents, while obscuring the very transparency needed to preserve public trust in democratic institutions. Critics, including civil rights organizations, argue that aggressive enforcement tactics, combined with diminished internal oversight, create spaces where deadly outcomes go unexplained, and accountability evaporates. National conversations buzzed with competing narratives. Federal officials defended agents' decisions as lawful exercises of force in the face of perceived threat, while local leaders demanded independent, impartial investigations with state and local participation. In Minneapolis, state investigators initially joined the inquiry only to be sidelined when federal authorities assumed sole control of evidence and interviews, prompting public outcry and questions about jurisdictional fairness. For Jamal, the broader debate resonated on a personal level. He had felt the sharp edge of systemic ambiguity in how agents interpreted authority, and how procedural rigidity can eclipse individual rights. His own reflection became part of a larger tapestry, a mosaic of narratives where policy meets prejudice, where enforcement meets empathy, and where institutional power meets human consequence. Conversations about reform grew urgent. Lawyers argued for clearer UCL-reinforced standards, independent oversight of federal enforcement actions, and stronger protections against prolonged detainment without explicit cause. Community leaders called for federal agents operating in interior cities to abide by local civilian review boards, mechanisms that tether enforcement to accountable, transparent community standards. Yet reform was not simple. Federal agencies cited operational complexity, the need for officer safety, and legal mandates that sometimes appeared at odds with community expectations. The debate was not just procedural, it was philosophical. How should a society balance the imperatives of law enforcement with the foundational rights of citizens? What weight does human dignity carry when measured against bureaucratic mandates? Jamal watched these debates unfold on screens and in print, his own story now woven into that national fabric. But beyond the headlines and policy briefs, he felt the subtler threads the quiet cost carried in his daughter, hesitant questions, the way his partner's eyes lingered on him a little longer in the mornings, and how even familiar routes through the city now felt laden with unseen possibility and risk. In moments of solitude, he found himself at the same kitchen table, now strewn with reform proposals, legal analysis, and community statements. Each document was a testament to the collective urgency for change, yet none offered simple solace. The quiet that followed each conversation was heavier than before, filled with the paradox of hope and ambivalence. Closure did not arrive with legislative reform, not then. What came instead was a collective willingness to confront injustice without flinching, to examine authority without deference, and to transform reflection into action. Workshops on citizens' rights and encounters with law enforcement sprang up across neighborhoods. Town halls brimmed with questions about enforcement transparency, body-worn camera policies, and the jurisdictional boundaries between federal and local authorities. Something deeper was taking shape. Cultural insistence that every encounter, from a routine stop to a federal operation, must be grounded in humanity as much as it is in law. Jamal's own narrative, once isolated in its tension, became emblematic of a larger realization that systemic structures, no matter how codified, are ultimately shaped by the choices individuals make within them. And so the final scene settled into a quieter frame. Children playing in early morning light, neighbors greeting one another on sidewalks, Jamal returning to familiar streets with an awareness that was both heavier and clearer. The city breathed around him, a living mosaic of history, struggle, and possibility. The reckoning was ongoing, unfinished, and necessary, a reminder that justice is not a final destination but a continuous dialogue between authority and accountability, between power and compassion. In that space, Jamal found a kind of quiet resolve, not triumphant, but deeply human. And in the soft dawn of a new day, the weight of yesterday's tension settled into a steady focus on what must come next. Reform rooted in understanding, in policy reshaped by human stories, and in a collective commitment to justice that sees beyond uniform